The engine died at 0200 hours. Chief Machinist's mate Walter Kowalski was 3 decks below the waterline when he heard it, the cough, the stutter, and then the terrible silence as the destroyer escort USS Harmon's main engine seized. The vibration that had been his constant companion for 6 months simply stopped. In the sudden quiet, he could hear the ocean pressing against the hull, and somewhere far above, the distant boom of depth charges. It was February 1943, in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the Harmon had just gone dead in the water. Above them, a wolf pack of German U-boats was tearing a convoy apart. Around them, 37 merchant ships carrying 5,000 troops, and enough supplies to sustain the Allied buildup in Britain, were scattered across 20 square miles of ocean, and the Harmon, the lead escort, the ship responsible for coordinating the defense, was now a floating target. The engine room went silent except for the hiss of steam and the distant rumble of explosions. Kowalski's crew stood frozen, waiting for orders, their faces pale in the emergency lighting. They knew what a dead engine meant in the middle of a U-boat attack. They knew the statistics. A stationary ship in these waters had a life expectancy measured in minutes. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with barely controlled panic. "Engine room. Report." Kowalski looked at the seized engine, at the smoke rising from the main bearing, at the chaos of his engineering crew scrambling to understand what had happened. He could feel the ship drifting, helpless, while somewhere above them the battle raged on without them. He picked up the phone. "Main engine is down, Captain. Bearing failure. We're dead in the water." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 3 seconds. It felt like an hour. "Then how long to fix it?" Kowalski knew the answer. A main bearing replacement required dry dock facilities, specialized equipment, and at least 72 hours of work. They were 800 miles from the nearest friendly port, surrounded by submarines, with 5,000 lives depending on them. "I don't know, sir," he said, "but I'll figure something out." To understand what Walter Kowalski faced that night, you have to understand what the Battle of the Atlantic had become by early 1943. The German U-boat campaign was at its peak. Admiral Karl Dönitz had assembled the largest submarine fleet in history, over 400 boats, and was deploying them in coordinated wolf packs that were bleeding the Allied merchant fleet dry. The numbers were catastrophic. In 1942, U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. In January 1943 alone, another 400,000 tons went to the bottom. Britain was importing barely half the food and supplies it needed to survive. Churchill called it, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war." The mathematics was simple and terrible. For every U-boat the Allies sank, the Germans were destroying 10 times their tonnage in merchant shipping. Britain's food reserves were down to 3 months. Rationing had cut civilian consumption to survival levels. If the convoys stopped getting through, the island nation would starve before summer. The war in Europe would be lost not on battlefields, but in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The destroyer escorts were the thin line between survival and starvation. These small, fast warships were designed for one purpose: hunting submarines and protecting convoys. But they were also fragile. Built quickly in shipyards across America, they were prone to mechanical failures, engine problems, and structural weaknesses that their designers had hoped wouldn't matter. A destroyer escort that lost power in the middle of a convoy battle wasn't just useless. It was a liability, a stationary target that drew submarines like blood in the water. The standard doctrine was clear: if an escort lost propulsion during combat, the other ships would attempt rescue of the crew. But the vessel itself was expendable. You couldn't stop a convoy to save one ship. The mathematics of war didn't allow it. The engineering manuals were equally clear: as a seized main bearing required complete disassembly of the engine, replacement of the bearing surfaces, and precision realignment. Minimum time in a fully equipped dry dock 72 hours. At sea with enemy submarines circling, the manual didn't even address the possibility. It was simply assumed to be impossible. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had studied the problem and concluded that emergency bearing repairs at sea were not feasible. The tolerances were too tight, the equipment requirements too specialized, the environmental conditions too uncontrolled. Every analysis reached the same conclusion: if a main bearing failed at sea, the ship was dead. But the manuals hadn't accounted for Walter Kowalski. Walter Kowalski was born in Hamtramck, Michigan in 1912, the son of Polish immigrants who had come to America to work in the automobile factories. His father spent 30 years on the assembly line at Ford, and Walter grew up with grease under his fingernails and the smell of machine oil in his clothes. The factory was his playground, the machines his toys. He started working in the factories at 16, lying about his age to get a job as a machine operator. By 20, he was a journeyman mechanic. By 25, he was one of the best troubleshooters in Detroit, the man they called when an engine wouldn't run, and nobody could figure out why. Walt could listen to an engine and tell you what was wrong with it. One of his former coworkers remembered. He'd put his hand on the block, close his eyes, and just feel it. Then he'd point to a bearing or a valve or a piston and say, "That's your problem." 9 times out of 10, he was right. The 10th time, he was still closer than anyone else. What made Kowalski different wasn't just his diagnostic skill. It was his willingness to improvise. Factory mechanics were trained to follow procedures, to replace parts according to specifications, to do things by the book. Kowalski had learned something else in the Depression-era factories, where parts were scarce and budgets were tight. He had learned to make things work with whatever was available. The book tells you what should work, he used to say. But when you don't have what you should have, you figure out what will work. That's the difference between a mechanic and an engineer. The engineer designs for perfect conditions. The mechanic fixes things in the real world. When the war came, Kowalski enlisted in the Navy and requested assignment to the engine room. He was 30 years old, too old for combat duty but perfect for the engineering department. The Navy needed men who understood machinery, who could keep the ships running through conditions that would destroy lesser equipment and lesser men. He reported aboard the USS Harmon in September 1942 and spent the next 5 months learning every inch of the ship's propulsion system. He memorized the engine's rhythms, its quirks, its weaknesses. He knew which valves stuck when the weather was cold. He knew which bearings ran hot under full power. He knew the secret rhythms that told him when something was about to fail. The other engineers respected him. The younger sailors were a little afraid of him. He had no patience for carelessness, no tolerance for men who didn't take the machinery seriously. "This engine is keeping us alive," he would say. "You treat it with respect or it'll kill you." And on a frozen February night in the North Atlantic, with 5,000 lives hanging in the balance, he was about to learn exactly how much that knowledge was worth. The Harmon had been at sea for 11 days when the convoy was attacked. They were escorting 37 ships, troop ships packed with soldiers, tankers carrying aviation fuel, freighters loaded with tanks and artillery and ammunition, across the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world. The weather had been brutal, with gale, force winds and 30-foot swells that made even basic seamanship a struggle. The engine had been running hot for 3 days. Kowalski had reported it to the captain, recommended reducing speed to ease the strain, but the convoy's schedule didn't allow for delays. They pressed on, and Kowalski watched the temperature gauges climb and prayed that the bearings would hold. He knew the signs of a bearing about to fail: the slight roughness in the vibration, the gradual increase in oil temperature, the subtle change in the engine's sound that most people wouldn't notice. He noticed, and he knew they were running out of time. They didn't. When the U-boats attacked at midnight, the Harmon was in the thick of it, racing between contacts, dropping depth charges, coordinating the defense by radio. The engine was pushed to its limit and beyond. At 0200 it finally gave up. Kowalski stood in the engine room, surrounded by his crew, and assessed the damage. The main bearing had seized completely, welded itself to the shaft by friction and heat. The standard fix was impossible. You couldn't replace a bearing at sea. The engine was finished. He put his hand on the engine block, feeling the heat radiating from the ruined bearing. He could smell the burnt metal, the scorched oil. 20 years of working with engines told him everything he needed to know about what had happened. The bearing had run dry, probably a blocked oil channel, maybe debris in the lubrication system. Without oil, metal had ground against metal until both surfaces welded together. But as Kowalski stared at the ruined machinery, his mind was already working on a different problem. Not how to fix the engine, how to make it run anyway. "Everyone shut up," he said quietly. "I need to think." The crew fell silent. They knew that tone. It meant Kowalski was working on something, turning the problem over in his mind, examining it from angles that nobody else would think to try. The idea came to him in pieces, assembled from years of improvised repairs and impossible fixes. The bearing was destroyed, but the bearing wasn't the only thing that could support the shaft. What if he could create a substitute, something that would carry the load long enough to get them moving? He thought about the materials available on the ship: steel, copper, brass, lubricating oil, and something else, something that most engineers would never think of using in a main engine bearing. Lead. The Harmon carried lead ballast in her bilges, hundreds of pounds of soft metal used to adjust the ship's trim. Lead was malleable, self-lubricating under pressure, and had been used in bearings since the Roman era. It wasn't as durable as the white metal bearing surface that had failed, but it might, just might, work long enough. In the Detroit factories, Kowalski had seen old-timers use lead to repair worn bearings in machinery that couldn't be taken offline. It was a temporary fix, a stopgap that would last days or weeks instead of years. But days or weeks wasn't what they needed. They needed hours. Just enough hours to get the convoy to safety. "I need all the lead we can find," Kowalski told his crew. "Every piece of ballast in the bilges. And I need a way to melt it. Get me the damage control torches." His chief petty officer, a man named Hendricks who had been at sea for 20 years, stared at him. "You want to pour molten lead into the bearing housing, while U-boats are hunting us. I want to get this ship moving," Kowalski said. "The captain needs us back in the fight. The convoy needs us. You have a better idea?" Nobody did. The crew looked at each other, at the dead engine, at the man who was proposing something that no engineering manual had ever contemplated. Then they started gathering lead. The captain's name was Lieutenant Commander James Hendricks, a career Navy officer who had been at sea since 1935. He had survived Pearl Harbor, survived the early disasters of the Pacific War, and transferred to the Atlantic because he believed the convoy battles were where the war would be won or lost. He had lost 2 ships in his career, both to enemy action, and had no intention of losing a third. When Kowalski called the bridge to explain his plan, Hendricks listened in silence. The idea sounded insane, pouring molten lead into a precision engine component while the ship was under attack. Every principle of marine engineering said it couldn't work. Every regulation said it shouldn't even be attempted. But Hendricks had learned something in his years at sea. Sometimes the regulations didn't know what they were talking about. Sometimes the only way forward was the way that wasn't supposed to work. He asked the only question that mattered. "Will it work?" "I don't know, sir. I've never done it before. Nobody has. But the theory is sound, and I don't see another option." "How long?" "For hours. Maybe 5. Hendricks looked at the tactical plot, at the submarine contacts circling the convoy, at the merchant ships dying one by one. Without the Harmon, the defense was falling apart. The other escorts were doing their best, but they couldn't coordinate effectively without their lead ship. With the Harmon back in action, they had a chance. "Do it," he said. "I'll keep the U-boats off you as long as I can." For the next 4 hours, the USS Harmon fought 2 battles simultaneously. Above decks, the gun crews manned their stations, firing at any periscope that showed itself, dropping depth charges at any contact reported by sonar. The other escorts tried to cover the gap left by the Harmon's immobility, but there were too many submarines and not enough defenders. 3 merchant ships were hit in the first 2 hours. 1 tanker that went up in a pillar of flame. 2 freighters that simply disappeared beneath the waves. Below decks, Kowalski and his crew performed surgery on a dying engine. The first step was removing the destroyed bearing, a job that would normally take a full work shift in a dry dock. They did it in 45 minutes, working by battle lanterns when the power flickered, ignoring the explosions that shook the ship. The ruined bearing came out in pieces, metal fragments that had once been precision, machined surfaces, now welded together by heat and friction into a useless mass. The second step was preparing the housing. Kowalski cleaned it himself, scraping away every trace of debris, ensuring the surface was ready to receive the molten lead. 1 contamination, 1 pocket of moisture, and the new bearing would fail before it ever turned. He worked by feel as much as by sight, his fingers detecting imperfections that his eyes couldn't see in the dim emergency lighting. The third step was the pour. They melted the lead in a makeshift crucible, a steel bucket heated by acetylene torches, and when it was liquid, Kowalski personally carried it to the bearing housing and poured it in a steady stream, filling the gap where the original bearing had been. The heat was intense, the fumes toxic, but Kowalski didn't flinch. The ship lurched as a depth charge exploded nearby. Kowalski kept pouring, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. The fourth step was the most critical, waiting for the lead to cool and harden, then hand scraping it to fit the shaft. This was where Kowalski's years in Detroit factories paid off. He worked by touch, feeling the clearances with his fingertips, scraping away thousandths of an inch at a time until the shaft could turn freely in its new bearing. Too tight, and it would seize again. Too loose, and it would wobble and destroy itself. The margin for error was measured in thousandths of an inch. At 06:15, 3 hours and 45 minutes after the engine died, Kowalski picked up the phone to the bridge. "We're ready to try it, Captain. But I have to warn you, this bearing won't take full power. We'll be limited to 2/3 speed, maybe less. And I don't know how long it'll hold. Could be 6 hours, could be 6 minutes. Understood. Start the engine." Kowalski hung up the phone and looked at his crew. They were exhausted, covered in grease and lead dust, their faces hollow in the emergency lighting. They had just done something that every manual said was impossible. Now they were about to find out if it would work. "Start her up," Kowalski said quietly. The starter motors engaged. The massive engine turned over once, twice, and caught. The vibration returned, different now, rougher than before, with a subtle rhythm that told Kowalski the new bearing was working, but working hard. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't elegant, but it was alive. The USS Harmon was moving again. The next 6 hours would become the stuff of Navy legend, though few outside the convoy ever heard the full story. The Harmon, running on an improvised lead bearing that no engineering manual had ever sanctioned, rejoined the battle. Kowalski stayed in the engine room the entire time, monitoring the bearing temperature, adjusting the oil flow, nursing the wounded engine through maneuvers it was never designed to perform. Every time the captain called for more speed, Kowalski gave him what he could, pushing the jury-rigged bearing to its limits and then slightly beyond. He could feel the vibration changing as the lead wore against the shaft, could hear the subtle differences in the engine's rhythm that told him how much life the bearing had left. The lead bearing held. Hour after hour, it carried the load, spinning in its makeshift housing while the Harmon hunted submarines. When the U-boats tried to press their attack, the Harmon was there to intercept them. When the convoy changed course to evade a torpedo spread, the Harmon was there to screen the turn. By midday, the wolf pack had broken off the attack, driven away by the unexpectedly fierce resistance. By evening, the convoy had reached the protection of air cover from Iceland. Final tally: 3 merchant ships lost out of 37. 2 U-boats confirmed sunk, 2 more probably damaged. The wolf pack had been driven off before it could complete its attack. And 5,000 troops, men who would have drowned in the freezing Atlantic if the convoy had been overwhelmed, reached Britain safely. They would eventually board landing craft for the beaches of Normandy, never knowing how close they had come to dying 800 miles from shore, all because a mechanic from Detroit figured out how to make an engine run on a bearing made of melted lead ballast. The Germans never understood what happened during that convoy battle. Their intelligence analysts noted the Harmon's temporary loss of power and expected the ship to be abandoned or sunk. When it reappeared in the middle of the fight, they attributed it to error in their observations. Perhaps the ship had never actually lost power. Perhaps their submarine commanders had misidentified the target. The idea that an American destroyer escort had repaired a catastrophic engine failure in the middle of combat, using techniques that violated every principle of marine engineering, never occurred to them. German naval doctrine was built on precision, on following procedures, on doing things correctly. Some things were simply impossible, except when they weren't. The Harmon limped into Reykjavik 3 days later, running on the lead bearing that Kowalski had created. The Navy engineers who examined the ship were astounded. The bearing had worn significantly but was still functional. Kowalski estimated it could have lasted another 100 hours of operation if needed. This shouldn't have worked. The chief engineer at the repair facility said, examining Kowalski's improvised repair, "Every principle of bearing design says it shouldn't have worked. The loads are too high. The material is too soft. The clearances are all wrong. The principals don't know what they're talking about." Kowalski replied, "I've been fixing engines since I was 16. Sometimes you have to ignore what should work and figure out what will work. The theory says it's impossible. The engine says it ran for 6 hours. I'll trust the engine." The Navy's Bureau of Ships launched an investigation into Kowalski's technique. Engineers analyzed the lead bearing, ran calculations, conducted tests. Their conclusion: the repair should have failed within the first hour of operation. The loads were too high, the material too soft, the conditions too uncontrolled. The fact that it lasted for 6 hours of combat maneuvering was, in their words, mechanically improbable. When asked to explain how the impossible had happened, Kowalski just shrugged. "The lead didn't know it wasn't supposed to work," he said. "Neither did I, so it worked. But the Navy also recognized what Kowalski had accomplished. His technique, modified and improved based on his experience, was documented and distributed to engineering crews throughout the Atlantic Fleet. The Kowalski method for emergency bearing repair became part of the unofficial knowledge base that destroyer escort crews shared among themselves, passed from ship to ship, from veteran to newcomer. It would be used at least 3 more times during the war, saving ships that would otherwise have been lost. Each time, the repair worked longer than the engineers said it should. Each time, the men who performed it said they were just following what Kowalski had figured out. The Harmon served until the end of the war, surviving 12 more convoy battles in the Atlantic. Kowalski remained aboard as chief engineer, keeping the ship running through conditions that would have defeated less determined men. The engine was repaired properly in Reykjavik, but Kowalski kept his techniques ready, just in case. He developed a reputation throughout the fleet as the man who could fix anything, the mechanic who refused to accept that something was impossible. Other ships would radio the Harmon for advice when their engines failed. "Ask Kowalski" became a common phrase among the destroyer escort crews. If anyone can figure it out, he can. In 1945, he was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the February convoy battle, one of the few engineering ratings ever to receive the decoration for mechanical rather than combat heroism. The citation praised his extraordinary courage, exceptional technical skill, and determined perseverance in the face of extreme danger. Kowalski never talked much about the award. When asked about it, he would shrug and say he was just doing his job. The engine needed to run, he'd say. "So I made it run. That's what engineers do." The war ended in May 1945. Walter Kowalski was discharged in September, with his Navy Cross and his chief petty officer's pension and not much else. He went back to Detroit. He found work at a small engine repair shop in Hamtramck, fixing cars and trucks and anything else that came through the door. He married a woman named Helen who had worked in the bomber plant during the war. They had 2 sons, both of whom would grow up to be engineers, one mechanical, one electrical. He never went back to the big factories, said he'd had enough of working for other people, enough of building things on someone else's schedule. The transition to civilian life wasn't easy. After years of high-stakes repairs where lives depended on his skill, fixing carburetors and replacing brake pads seemed almost trivial. He missed the pressure, the urgency, the feeling that what he did mattered. But he adapted, as he had always adapted, finding satisfaction in the small repairs and the grateful customers who brought their cars back year after year, because Walt Kowalski always got it right. He kept a piece of the original lead bearing in his toolbox for the rest of his life, a chunk of soft metal that had helped save 5,000 men. When his sons asked about it, he would tell them the story, not boastfully, but matter-of-factly, the way you might describe any difficult job that had worked out in the end. "The engine needed to run," he would say. "So I made it run. That's what engineers do. That's what mechanics do. We don't accept that things are broken. We figure out how to make them work." His sons grew up hearing that philosophy, and they carried it into their own careers. Both became engineers, both known for their ability to find solutions when the textbooks said there weren't any. They learned it from their father, who had learned it from the Depression-era factories of Detroit, who had proven it in the engine room of a destroyer escort in the middle of the North Atlantic. In 1983, a naval historian researching emergency repair techniques during World War II came across references to the Kowalski method in declassified documents. He tracked down Walter, then 71 years old and still working part-time at the shop, his hands still steady, his eyes still sharp. The historian wanted to interview him for a book about unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. Walter talked for 3 hours. He explained the technical details of the repair, the calculations he had made in his head, while the ship shook from depth charges, the fear he had suppressed because there wasn't time to be afraid. He talked about his crew, about Captain Hendricks, about the 5,000 men in the convoy who never knew how close they had come to disaster. He talked about the lead bearing with the precision of an engineer and the affection of an artist describing his masterpiece. "It wasn't pretty," he said. "The factory engineers would have had a heart attack if they'd seen it. But it worked. That's what matters. Not how it looks, not whether it follows the rules. Whether it works." The historian asked if Walter felt his contribution had been overlooked, if he resented the lack of public recognition. Walter shook his head. "I was an engineer," he said. "My job was to keep the engine running. That night I kept it running. That's all. The men who deserved recognition were the ones on deck, fighting the submarines, facing the enemy. I was just in the engine room, doing my job. He paused, looking at the piece of lead bearing he still kept in his toolbox. But I'll tell you something, he said. That night was the best work I ever did. Not because of the medal, not because of the recognition. Because it worked. Because when it needed to work more than anything had ever needed to work in my life, I figured it out. That's what engineering is. That's what it means to really understand machines. Walter Kowalski died in 1991 at the age of 79. He was buried in a veterans cemetery in Michigan, next to other men who had served in the war. His gravestone lists his name, his dates, his rate, Chief Machinist's mate, USN 1941-1945. It doesn't mention the bearing. It doesn't mention the convoy. It doesn't mention the 5,000 men who reached Britain because a mechanic from Hamtramck refused to accept that his engine was finished. But the sailors who served on the Harmon remembered. They told the story to their children and grandchildren. The story of the night the engine died and the chief who brought it back to life. The story of the impossible repair that saved 5,000 men. And somewhere in the archives of the Navy's Bureau of Ships, technical documents still describe the Kowalski method, the impossible repair that worked when nothing else would. Some of those documents are still classified. Some of the techniques Kowalski developed are still in use, refined and improved over decades, but still based on the same principle. When the standard solution doesn't work, find another way. There's a lesson in Walter Kowalski's story, though it's not the one you might expect. It's not about engineering, though what he did that night was engineering of the highest order. It's not about courage, though working on a wounded engine while depth charges exploded around you required a special kind of bravery. The lesson is about refusing to accept the impossible. The manuals said the bearing couldn't be repaired at sea. The engineers said a lead bearing couldn't handle the load. The experts said it was mechanically improbable, and they were all right, on paper, using the assumptions they had been trained to accept. But Walter Kowalski hadn't learned engineering from manuals. He had learned it from years of making broken things work, from Depression-era factories where you fixed what you had because you couldn't afford to replace it. He knew something the experts had forgotten, that the rules were guidelines, not laws. That sometimes the impossible was just the untried. Every engineer on every ship in the Atlantic knew the same principles that Kowalski knew. They had all studied the same physics, learned the same formulas, read the same manuals. But only Kowalski, a factory mechanic from Detroit, with grease under his fingernails and 30 years of fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable, saw past what couldn't be done to what might work anyway. That's the real lesson of that February night. Not that the rules don't matter. They do. But sometimes the rules don't know everything. Sometimes the thing that shouldn't work is the only thing that will. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't firepower or strategy or superior numbers. Sometimes it's just one person refusing to accept that something can't be done and figuring out how to do it anyway. One engineer, one bearing, one night, 5,000 lives. That's the story they never told you about the Battle of the Atlantic. That's the missing page. Araf, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Stories like Walter's, the forgotten heroes, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things, they deserve to be remembered. If you want to hear more of them, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. Until next time.